In 1756, the world was a place where freedom was not a birthright for everyone, and Sarah Williams was born into a reality where every breath was owned by someone else. She woke up each morning to the sound of chains and commands, the kind of life where your name is not a symbol of identity, but a label of ownership. She would rise with the sun, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, and her days were spent doing the work no one else wanted to do. Her hands raw from scrubbing floors, her back aching from bending over in the fields, her spirit slowly being chipped away by the cruel laughter of those who called themselves masters. She saw the world through lowered eyes, because eye contact could mean punishment, and punishment was never light. The house she lived in was grand for those who owned it. Polished wood floors, walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, dining tables laid out with silverware that gleamed like the sun. And yet for Sarah, this house was a cage, every corner, a reminder of her place in the world. Every order barked at her like a whip. Her clothes were coarse and plain, her food scraps from the same table she cleaned. Her existence was one of service, not choice. She had to listen to their conversations, their gossip, their laughter, and sometimes their cruelty toward her and others like her. She had no right to respond, no right to defend herself, no right to anything but obedience. She learned to move silently, to make herself invisible, because invisibility was safer than being noticed. Day after day, she watched the family who owned her eat and drink and celebrate. She saw them feast while she starved. She saw them talk about freedom and rights. While denying hers, she saw them punish others for the smallest mistakes, and she saw the fear that spread through the other slaves whenever one of them was dragged away for punishment. She carried all these images inside her like fire smoldering just under the surface, and even though she looked calm on the outside, inside she was screaming, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. Why them? Why her? Why this life? And why was no one coming to save her? The world around her was not just cruel. It was indifferent. There were no voices calling for justice, no movements to free her, no laws to protect her. And that knowledge settled in her chest like a heavy stone. She realized that if anything was going to change, it would have to be by her own hand. She started noticing things, small details about the way the household worked, what the family ate and drank, where the keys were kept, when they were most distracted. When they trusted her enough to turn their backs, she became a quiet observer, gathering information not because she wanted revenge at first, but because watching was the only power she had. It gave her a sense of control, even if it was only in her mind. Sarah was young, but not naive. She understood that in her world, mercy was a weakness, and silence was survival. She had learned early on not to cry in front of them, not to beg, not to plead, because that only made them feel powerful. So she swallowed her tears, until they became something else, entirely something hard and cold. She felt it growing in her chest like a second heartbeat, and with every cruel word, every slap, every insult, it grew stronger until it no longer felt like pain but purpose. It was not that she wanted to destroy it, was that she wanted to be free, and freedom was not something they would ever give willingly. And so Sarah walked through that house every day with a mask on her face, bowing when told to bow, smiling when told to smile, answering when spoken to. But underneath that mask was a storm waiting to break. She felt it in her body, in the way her hands clenched into fists when no one was looking, in the way her jaw tightened when she heard the sound of laughter at someone's suffering. She knew there would come a moment when she could no longer pretend, when the mask would slip and her true thoughts would show. And she both feared and longed for that moment, because it meant that she was still alive, that she had not been broken completely, that somewhere deep inside her there was still a spark that refused to die. There came a day when everything shifted, and it was not a dramatic event to anyone else, but to Sarah it was the final straw that turned her quiet suffering into a storm. The family had been in a foul mood that morning, and the smallest mistake seemed to ignite their tempers. Sarah had been carrying a tray of bread, fresh from the oven, when one of the children bumped into her, and the tray tipped slightly. Nothing had even fallen, but the master saw it and decided it was reason enough to punish her. He grabbed her by the arm, hard enough to leave bruises, and dragged her into the yard where everyone could see. She stood there with the sun beating down on her neck as he shouted about incompetence and laziness, his voice sharp like a whip. She did not argue. She did not cry. She just stared at the ground and took it. But something inside her cracked that day. The humiliation was sharp and cold, like ice spreading through her veins. She could feel the other slaves watching, unable to help her, and she hated the look in their eyes, not because it was pity, but because it was resignation. They had seen this happen too many times. They had learned to accept it and go on. And Sarah felt a kind of rage that scared even her. She realized she could not accept this as normal. She could not just go on as if nothing had happened. She went back to work after the punishment, but every step she took felt heavier, as if the earth itself was pulling her down. She kept thinking about how easy it had been for him to hurt her, how easy it had been for them to laugh at her pain, and she knew this was not going to stop. It would never stop unless someone made it stop. That night, when the house was quiet, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling, her body sore, her mind alive. She replayed the scene over and over, hearing the shouts, seeing the sneer on his face, feeling the roughness of his grip, and each time she saw it, her anger grew hotter. It was no longer just about that moment. It was about every moment before it, every insult, every strike, every command that had forced her to kneel lower and lower. She thought about running. She thought about fighting back. She thought about what freedom might taste like. She could almost feel it on her tongue, and that taste made her heart beat faster. She realized she was at a point where she would rather risk death than live another day in chains. Over the next few days, she began to notice that her thoughts were changing. She no longer just did what she was told, out of fear. She did it while secretly imagining what it would be like if the people giving orders were gone. She began to see them differently, not as untouchable figures but as flesh and blood, as vulnerable as anyone else. She began to pay closer attention to their routines, who left the table first, who stayed the longest, who trusted her with the wine, who ignored her presence completely. And the more she watched, the more she realized they never saw her coming. They never thought she could be dangerous. They believed she was too small, too weak, too broken to ever lift her head. Sarah felt something she had not felt in years, a sense of control, no matter how small it was. It gave her a strange calm. She carried out her chores. But in her mind, she was no longer just a servant. She was a strategist. Her humiliation had been turned into fuel, and every order they gave her became another reason to keep moving forward. She found herself imagining a day when they would look at her and see something they had never seen before, someone they could not command, someone who would not kneel, and those thoughts terrified her and thrilled her all at once. Her breaking point was not a single moment, but a slow burning fire that had finally reached its peak. She could feel it in the way her breath caught when she heard their voices in the distance, in the way her hands tightened around a kitchen knife when no one was looking. It was not just anger, it was resolve, the kind that once it takes hold will never let go. She did not yet know exactly what she would do or when, but she knew the decision had been made somewhere deep inside her. And there was no going back now, because the girl who had once bowed her head had been replaced by someone else. Someone who could no longer be silenced, someone who had already chosen her path, even if the world had not seen it yet. In the days that followed, Sarah began to live two lives, the one that everyone could see and the one that no one could detect on the surface. She was the same quiet, obedient servant who moved about the house doing her work without complaint. But inside her mind, she was building something step by step. She started to keep track of every detail, the way the kitchen was stocked when the deliveries came, what spices were kept where and who handled the wine. She noticed which meals made the family tired, which ones they loved most, which ones they sent back untouched. She listened to their conversations, not as background noise but as valuable information. Each careless word they spoke became a clue she could use later. Each complaint about a dish, each request for something sweeter or richer was stored away carefully. She knew that her power lay in her invisibility. They did not see her as a threat, and that gave her an advantage. She could walk past them with a knife in her hand, and they would think only of the dinner she was preparing. She could overhear secrets, and no one would care, because to them she was not a person worth noticing. She learned to turn this to her advantage, becoming even quieter, moving with even more precision so she could be present without being seen. It gave her time to think, to plan, to imagine. She began to look at the tools in the kitchen differently, no longer as objects of labor but as possible instruments of fate. The fire, the pots, the bottles, all of them held potential, and that potential became something she thought about every single day. There was a strange calm that settled over her as the plan began to take shape. She was no longer consumed by the sharp sting of anger. Now her thoughts were cool and deliberate. She would spend hours at the hearth stirring the stew or kneading dough, while mapping out every step in her mind, what she would use when she would strike, how she would ensure that no one suspected her until it was too late. She was careful to avoid suspicion, never rushing, never acting out of impulse. She had seen what happened to others who acted rashly. They were caught and punished and made examples of, and Sarah knew she could not afford to fail. Failure would mean suffering beyond anything she had already endured, and so she waited and worked and watched until she was certain that her moment would come. As she gathered the pieces of her plan, she also gathered her strength. She began to eat a little more when she could to save her energy. She made sure to keep her face neutral, never letting them see the thoughts behind her eyes. She spoke when spoken to, she smiled when required, but inside she was somewhere else, entirely, somewhere far away from the house, from the fields, from the life she had been forced to live. She saw herself standing tall, walking free, breathing, without fear, and that vision kept her steady, even when the days were long and the nights were cold. She refused to let herself break now, because breaking would mean losing the one thing she had left, her ability to choose her moment. The other slaves did not know what was going on inside her. They only saw that Sarah had become even quieter, more withdrawn. Some may have thought she was giving up, but in truth, she was preparing. She did not share her plan with anyone because she knew the risk was too great. Even a whisper in the wrong ear could destroy everything she had built, and so she kept her secret close to her heart like a hidden weapon. It gave her strength in a place where strength was a dangerous thing to have. She knew she would have to face this alone, and she accepted that because she had already accepted the cost, whatever it might be. And so the days went by, and Sarah waited patiently, her plan like a seed growing in the dark. Every morning when she woke, she wondered if today would be the day, and every night she went to bed knowing she was one step closer. Her fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her. It became a companion, reminding her of what was at stake, keeping her sharp, keeping her careful. She knew that when the moment came, she would have only one chance, and she was determined not to waste it. Her life had been shaped by the choices of others, but what she was building now was hers alone, and that knowledge became her strength, her silent rebellion, her quiet promise to herself that one day everything would change. The evening of the dinner arrived, and Sarah felt the weight of it from the moment the first light of dawn touched the house. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she prepared the kitchen, her hands steady, even though her heart thudded against her chest like a drum. She moved through the pantry, selecting each ingredient as if every choice mattered, because tonight every detail would matter. She chopped and stirred and seasoned with care, but her thoughts were not on the taste. They were on the outcome. Every movement had meaning. Every gesture was calculated. She could hear the laughter of the family in the other room as they prepared for their gathering, unaware that the woman in the kitchen was shaping the last meal they would ever share. She worked without pause, letting her body follow the rhythm of the task, while her mind stayed cold and clear. She thought about the months that had led to this moment, every insult, every bruise, every night spent staring at the ceiling and imagining what freedom might feel like. She thought about how much she had risked and how close she was to changing everything. Her fear was still there, but it was different now. Not the paralyzing fear of punishment, but the sharp electric fear that comes just before stepping into the unknown. She breathed deeply to keep herself calm, her face expressionless so that no one passing by would notice the storm raging behind her eyes. When the table was finally set and the food ready, she moved with precision, placing each dish exactly where it belonged. She poured the wine with steady hands, listening to the clinking of glasses and the chatter that filled the room. It almost felt surreal to stand there serving them as if it were just another ordinary night, but Sarah knew it was anything but ordinary. Her pulse quickened with every step she took around the table. Every time a plate was filled, she felt the air in the room grow heavier, as though the house itself knew what was about to unfold. She kept her head down, but her ears caught every sound, every scrape of a chair, every laugh, every careless word that reminded her why she was here. The family began to eat, and Sarah stood in the corner. Her hands clasped in front of her, she watched them chew, swallow, and drink as though it were a performance she had seen 1,000 times. But this time, every movement was significant, every bite bringing them closer to the point of no return. She felt her breathing slow, as if her body was forcing her to be still, to take in every detail and remember it all. She noticed how oblivious they were, how safe they felt, how they trusted her enough to eat what she had prepared without question, and that trust, which had once been a burden, now felt like her greatest weapon. As the dinner went on, Sarah felt time stretch and bend minutes, feeling like hours, her thoughts sharpened to a single point. This was the moment she had imagined so many times, and now that it was here, she felt a strange calm settle over her. It was as if her body knew exactly what to do. Her fear melted into focus, her anger into resolve. She no longer felt like the girl who had been dragged into the yard and humiliated. She felt like someone entirely new, someone who had taken control of her fate for the first time. She knew she could not turn back, not now. Not when she had come this far. She stood silently as the last plates were cleared, her eyes scanning the table one final time. She could hear the sound of their voices beginning to fade into the background as her thoughts grew louder, filling her head with the knowledge that everything was about to change. This was the moment she had built in secret, the moment she had carried in her heart through every day of pain and every night of fear. And now it was here, staring back at her from across the table, daring her to see it through. She felt her hands relax, her shoulders drop, and for the first time in her life she felt completely in control, as though the world itself had gone still to witness what she was about to do. The room was quiet, except for the sound of knives scraping against plates and glasses being set back down. Sarah stood in the corner, her expression unreadable as she watched them eat. Each bite felt like a drumbeat in her chest, marking the countdown to what she had been building toward for months. She could feel the sweat forming at the back of her neck. But her hands did not tremble, her breathing did not falter. She had been waiting for this exact moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt a strange sense of stillness settle over her. She thought of the long days in the fields, the bruises that had faded but never left her memory, the nights she had cried silently so no one would hear, all of it leading to this one dinner, this one night where the balance of power was finally shifting. One by one, they continued to eat, oblivious to her gaze, their laughter ringing through the room, their words careless as they spoke about the future, as if it was promised to them. Sarah felt a rush of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her, but she stayed rooted in place. Every gesture she made small and deliberate as she refilled glasses and cleared plates. Her heart pounded louder with every passing second, and yet she felt no fear, only clarity. She could see each detail of the room, as if it had been etched in her mind forever, the way the candlelight flickered on the polished wood, the faint sound of the wind outside, the way their faces looked so relaxed, so sure that nothing could touch them. As the minutes passed, Sarah felt the shift begin slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first she saw one of them pause, then another, their conversation stumbling into silence, as if someone had blown out a candle. The air seemed heavier now, filled with an unspoken tension. She stayed perfectly still, watching as realization began to spread across their faces. She felt no triumph, only a deep, steady calm, as though this moment had been written long before tonight. Her breathing slowed even more as she took in the scene, committing it to memory. Every movement, every sound, every look of confusion and fear. The family began to stir their chairs, scraping against the floor as they tried to stand, some clutching at their stomachs, others reaching for the table for support. The room that had been filled with noise just moments before was now filled with gasps and choked cries. Sarah did not move. She simply watched, her hands folded in front of her, her face blank as if she were outside her own body, witnessing it all from a distance. This was not chaos to her, this was order, the inevitable conclusion to everything that had come before. And in that stillness, she felt something uncoil deep inside her, as if she had been holding her breath her entire life and was finally letting it go. The scene unfolded slowly, painfully each second, stretching into eternity as the family struggled to make sense of what was happening. Sarah felt her heartbeat steady and strong, her body no longer heavy with fear or anger, but light as though a great weight had been lifted from her. She took a step back into the shadow of the room, her figure barely visible now, her silence more powerful than any word she could have spoken. She had no need to explain herself, no need to cry out. Her actions had already spoken louder than anything she could ever say. As the last voices faltered and the house grew eerily quiet, Sarah stood alone in the corner, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. She felt the tension in her body begin to melt away, her shoulders no longer tight, her fists no longer clenched. She let the silence wrap around her like a cloak, her eyes moving slowly over the room, taking in what she had done, not with pride but with a deep, unshakable certainty that there had never been another way. She had given everything she had to this moment, her fear, her pain, her very soul, and now all that remained was the sound of her own breathing, steady, strong, unbroken. When the last sound faded and the room was swallowed by silence, Sarah stood there feeling the weight of what had just happened sink into her chest. She could feel the heat from the candles flickering across her face, but the house itself seemed colder now, emptier, as if it had exhaled its last breath. She looked at the table, the plates half full, the glasses tipped on their sides, and for a moment it felt unreal, like she was standing inside a dream, one that was too sharp, too vivid to be just imagination. She felt the air thick around her, every inhale heavy, every exhale slow. The stillness pressed against her ears until it was almost deafening, and yet it was not frightening, it was freeing. She stepped forward, her feet light on the polished floor, and began clearing the table piece by piece as if she were performing the same nightly ritual she had done 1,000 times before. Her hands steady, her movements deliberate. She picked up the cutlery, wiped the table, gathered the plates as though this were any ordinary evening. There was a strange peace in the routine, a strange power in knowing that this time the quiet belonged to her. She was no longer rushing to serve, no longer waiting for the next order to be shouted across the room. There were no commands, no laughter, no voices telling her where to go or what to do, only her own breathing guiding her through the task. As she moved through the room, she felt her body loosen as though the chains that had bound her for years had fallen away one by one. She did not smile, she did not cry, but deep inside she felt a shift, something that told her she was not the same person who had stood here yesterday. She was not the girl who lowered her eyes and took the blows without protest. She was someone who had acted, who had taken her fate into her own hands. And that knowledge pulsed through her veins with every step she took. She moved with a kind of quiet grace, as if she were lighter than air, as if the weight she had been carrying all her life had dissolved. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and Sarah paused for a moment, listening to the sound. It felt like the world was reminding her that it was still there, that life beyond these walls was waiting. She thought about what tomorrow might bring, the questions that would come, the search that would follow, the risk that still lingered, but the thought did not shake her. Instead, it settled her even more, because she knew she had already faced the worst she could face and survived. She had faced her fear and her pain and turned them into something unstoppable, something that could never be taken back. She walked through the house one last time, touching the edges of the chairs, the frames of the doors, the handles of the cabinets, her fingers trailing over everything, as though she were saying goodbye to a life that had never been hers to begin with. She had spent years serving in these rooms, listening to their laughter, smelling their perfume, hearing their voices fill the air. And now the house stood silent, its walls holding only her presence. For the first time, she felt as though the space belonged to her, as though she had claimed something that had been denied to her all her life, even if only for a brief moment it was hers. When she finally stood at the doorway, she turned back for a moment, her eyes scanning the room one last time, taking it all in the dim light, the shadows stretching across the floor, the table still half set as if waiting for a meal that would never be finished. She let the image settle deep into her mind, knowing she would carry it with her wherever she went, not as a memory of horror, but as a reminder of the night she stopped being powerless, the night she stopped being invisible. And even though the world outside was still uncertain, she felt ready to face it, ready to walk through that door and meet whatever came next. The cost of what Sarah had done was not something she could measure in the silence of that night. It was a weight that pressed down on her chest, even as she felt the rush of freedom in her veins. She knew there would be a reckoning, a price to pay for choosing to act in a world that demanded her obedience. She thought about the risk she had taken, the danger she had placed herself in, and yet she felt no regret, because regret would have meant she wished to return to the life she had before, and that was no longer possible. Her choice had broken the chain that bound her, but it had also set something in motion that could not be undone. Her heart beat with a steady rhythm, reminding her that she was still here, still standing, still breathing. As the night stretched on, Sarah sat by the fire, her body tired but her mind sharp. She thought about what tomorrow would bring, the shouts, the chaos, the discovery of what had happened, and she wondered what her place would be in the story once it was told. She knew they would call her a monster. They would say she was dangerous. They would tell others about the night the servant rose against her masters. But Sarah did not see herself as a monster. She saw herself as a woman who had been pushed so far into the dark that the only way forward was through fire. She did not smile at the thought. She simply let it sit inside her like a truth she could not deny. The weight of her decision came with a strange calm, because for the first time in her life, she had chosen something for herself. She had acted not because she was told to, but because she had decided it was necessary, and that realization gave her a sense of power that no punishment could ever take away, even if tomorrow brought chains, even if tomorrow brought death. She knew she had faced the fear that had ruled her life, and she had won. She had looked into the face of her own helplessness and refused to bow her head. She had proven to herself that she was still alive, still capable of shaping her fate. In the quiet, she thought about the other slaves who had watched her endure the punishment in the yard. She thought about their lowered heads, their quiet acceptance, and she wondered if they would understand what she had done, if they would feel fear or pride or both. She did not expect them to follow her path, but she hoped that somewhere inside them a spark had been lit, that they would see it was possible to act even in a world that tried to crush every act of resistance. Perhaps they would never speak of it. Perhaps they would only carry the story in their hearts, but Sarah knew that stories had a way of living longer than the people who created them. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the heat from the fire warm her skin, the crackle of the wood filling the empty house. She felt her breathing slow and her thoughts settle into something steady. She was no longer racing through the plan, no longer bracing for the moment to come. She had already crossed that threshold, and now she was somewhere new, somewhere she had never been before. Her body ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded her she was still here, still fighting. She touched the floor beside her with the tips of her fingers, feeling the roughness of the wood, grounding herself in the reality of what she had done. When she opened her eyes again, the sky outside the window was beginning to pale with the first hint of morning. Sarah rose slowly, her legs heavy but strong, and looked toward the door. She did not know what waited for her beyond it, but she felt a strange peace settle over her shoulders like a cloak. She had given everything she had to this night. Her fear, her pain, her strength, and now she had nothing left to give except the promise to keep walking forward. Whatever came next would come, and she would meet it head on, not as the girl who had been made small, but as the woman who had taken back her power.